Alright, hi guys, it's your boy Rich here, back at it again, and let's talk Panerai and how it's had the biggest impact on the watch industry and its association with Rolex. Panerai burst onto the scene with their size capturing our attention, but it was also different, daring, and fresh. It was the very definition of an uncookie cutter watch, and we couldn't get enough of Panerai, and neither could Hollywood, and if you were anyone in Hollywood, you owned a Panerai. When we were introduced to Panerai, we were introduced to an all-new era, exciting times. We've never seen watches so big, and this would change the watch industry forever. Prior to Panerai, the 40mm Rolex Submariner was considered huge, and then Panerai would dwarf the once mighty Submariner. And from that point forward, every watch manufacturer was forced to go big, introducing us to 44, 46, 50mm watches, in some instances 60mm. Panerai would also give birth to brand new watch brands without any history or pedigree. They would just take advantage of the opportunity where bigger is better, and they were giving us watches in the 50 to 60mm sizes. But even with the watch growth booming, Rolex was reluctant to join in. To quote Patrick Swayze, "Nobody puts baby in a corner."
Nobody puts baby in a corner.
In fact, it wasn't until a good 4 or 5 years into the big watch era that Rolex finally succumbed by introducing us to the 43mm Sea Dweller, and I think it'd be reasonable to assume if it wasn't for Panerai, we may never have been introduced to the James Cameron. The Panerai influence is significant because not even Breitling during the 1990s, in Breitling's prime, could alter Rolex's plans by introducing us to new chronographs. During the 90s, the chronographs were king and Breitling was king, but that had no impact on Rolex. Only Panerai did. Some of us are aware Panerai used to make watches for the Italian military up until 1970 because Panerai watches no longer met naval specifications. But more interestingly is Rolex used to design and manufacture Panerai's watches during World War II. Panerai would then resurface in 1993 by marketing their watches to civilians. Us. Part of Panerai's cachet and allure was their exclusivity. Even though we've seen them on the likes of Stallone, Arnold, Statham, The Rock, they still offered a sense of a private membership. These watches were not easy to come by until Richemont took over, making them highly accessible, but it was also their downfall. Richemont is a company that owns some of the most well-known watches: A. Lange & Söhne, Cartier, Piaget, IWC, Vacheron. None of their holdings are cult watches or micro brands. They want everyone to know their watches. And they weren't going to make that exception with Panerai. So what was once a hard to come by watch became a watch we could find easily. We could find a Panerai boutique as easily as we could find a Starbucks. They were everywhere. And while this is good for the bottom line for Richemont, not so much for watch enthusiasts. Everything was coming up roses for Panerai until it wasn't. Anytime something becomes so successful so quickly, we dissect it and analyze it. And coincidentally, during Panerai's height, there was also the birth of the watch forums, which really started to take off, where we could freely express ourselves on any of the watches. And Panerai started to get slammed because of what they were charging without any discount by using an ETA movement. So around 2005 and 2006, Panerai introduced us to their first in-house movement. They did have some problems with it. I think it was with their PAM 318, where it was exposed as being a really poorly decorated movement for what they were charging. Panerai would eventually recover from that by decorating their movement much more appropriately for their in-house movement and for what they were charging. I owned two Panerais. My first one was in 40mm, was the Power Reserve. I think it was the PAM 125. And the second one was in 44mm with the OP and the hand wound movement. I don't remember the reference number on that one. I don't have either one anymore. And while I have no regrets selling my 44mm one, I do have some regrets selling my 40mm one. I was younger then and much more impressionable then, and it seemed like Panerai was meant to be in 44mm. But if I would have held on to that 40mm, I'm sure that I would be wearing that today. I always like the look of that size. I shouldn't have been so insecure back in the day. I do receive some questions sometimes asking, did that value go up? Because that was an ETA movement versus today's. And I don't think it did. The value of what I see that watch for today is about the same as it was back then. So the ETA movement in that case wasn't worth any more than Panerai's in-house movements. So most good things have to come to an end. And while Panerai once dominated the 44, 45, 46 millimeter segment, we've also shifted to the more classic or smaller size watches. And while Panerai still makes those sizes, some of them are thinner by as much as 40%. Panerai still makes a 40 millimeter Lumina Marina. I think that's the PAM 1058. And they also make a radio mirror in 42 millimeters now, whereas they used to be in 45 millimeters. My favorite Panerai is the radio mirror in 42 millimeter with the 3-day power reserve. That also goes for $10,000, but that is actually on my radar. And for those of us who like the 44 millimeter case size, I think a 42 would look just as great. In fact, 42 is wearable for most of us, regardless of our wrist size. Panerai was so influential that even though we've shifted down from the 44 millimeters smaller, we've now recognized 42 as a sweet spot. Up from 40 millimeters, we are now recognizing the 42 as a nice size watch, which might be smaller than what we're used to, but it's also bigger than what we're used to and an acceptable size. It seems Panerai has come full circle. What started off as a cult watch has turned into a really popular watch, which has morphed back into a cult watch. Panerai still has their fans, the Paneristas. They still have a lot of fans. And besides, we're not supposed to buy a watch based on its popularity, right? There can be made an argument for Panerai that they are positioned nicely for the future. As we know, trends are cyclical, and while we've shifted to the more smaller size watches, we will eventually return to the somewhat bigger size watches, more in the 44 to 46 millimeter range tops. I don't think we're going to see the 50 to 60 millimeter size watches anymore, and we shouldn't. And for those of us who bought into those size watches, I don't think we're going to look back at those times fondly. I think we're going to tell ourselves, I can't believe I wore a spare tire on my wrist. Those sizes should never return, just like the mullet should never return. Panerai is relevant today because of their 40 to 42 millimeter size watches and are ready for the future when we return to the bigger size watches, and we will return to the bigger size watches. When we eventually get tired of the somewhat smaller to classic size watches, we might seek somewhat more of the exciting times, but that won't be for another 10 to 12 years as we are now just entering the new phase. For a long time, any watch under 40 millimeters was considered unisex. Not anymore. To me, a hallmark of a really good watch is after a while of not wearing it, you return to it, really appreciating it again. And that's what Panerai is to me. I've returned to Panerai where it was no longer on my mind, but is now on my mind. And I think that represents or says a lot about Panerai's staying power. It may not be what it once was before, where we were all excited about it. It used to be whenever I would see a Panerai, I would excitedly grab that person's wrist and just say, ooh, that's a Panerai. Whereas now, not so much anymore. We've seen it, done it, and we've moved on. But when you step away from it a while and return to it and you fall in love with it all over again, it was meant to be. And that's what Panerai seems to be to me, where it's back on my mind. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you the next time. So while Panerai no longer has what? So you don't have to like Panerai for what it once was, as long as you like it for what it is. That kind of corny. I think Panerai has staying power, more so than some of its imitators, and that says a lot about Panerai.